Something changed. You can feel it. Not in them, in you. Something that used to pull you toward your phone, toward the checking, toward the hoping, it's quieter now. And the quiet is unfamiliar enough that it almost makes you nervous. Like you've been white-knuckling a rope for so long that letting go feels less like relief and more like falling. But you're not falling, you're landing. For the first time in a long time, you are actually landing inside yourself. And they can feel it from wherever they are. That's not speculation. That's the part this video is going to explain in full. There is a particular moment in the arc of an avoidant dynamic that almost nobody talks about. Not because it's rare, it happens consistently, almost predictably, but because it requires you to have reached a place that feels, from the inside, like giving up. It isn't giving up. It is the most powerful position you have occupied since this whole thing began. It is the moment your detachment becomes real. Not performed, not strategic, not the kind of distance you created hoping they would notice and close the gap. Real detachment, the kind that comes after you have finally exhaustively believed everything they showed you. And when that shift happens, when the energy you were endlessly pouring in their direction begins to consolidate back into you, something extraordinary occurs on their end. The avoidant, who has spent the entire relationship carefully managing the distance between you, suddenly finds themselves on the wrong side of it. The dynamic they constructed, the one where they held the withdrawal card, where they controlled the thermostat, where your pursuit gave them the safety of knowing you weren't going anywhere, that dynamic collapses, and they are left standing in a silence they created but did not actually want. To understand why your detachment hits an avoidant the way it does, you have to understand something fundamental about how they experience relationships. The avoidant attachment style is not at its core about not wanting connection. It is about wanting connection while being terrified of what connection costs. And the way that terror gets managed, the way an avoidant makes a relationship feel survivable, is through the maintenance of a very specific power balance. When you were pursuing, when you were reaching, when you were the one absorbing the uncertainty and continuing to show up anyway, you were, without knowing it, doing something that made the relationship feel safe to them. Your consistency in the face of their inconsistency told their nervous system that the connection was not going anywhere, that they could afford to take space, that they could retreat without consequence, that the door would still be open whenever the fear subsided enough for them to walk back through it. Your pursuing was their security blanket, and you paid for that with your peace. Now the blanket is gone, and what replaces it, on their end, is something they are profoundly unprepared for, because avoidants do not actually want to lose the people they pull away from. The withdrawal is not a desire for absence. It is a desire for a specific kind of presence, one that is available but not demanding, close but not consuming, warm but not so warm that it triggers the alarm system. They want you at a carefully managed distance, not gone, managed. When you become genuinely detached, you remove yourself from the management system entirely. You are no longer at the distance they set. You are at a distance you chose. And that distinction, the shift in who is holding the distance, changes everything. Because now the thing they feared most about intimacy is arriving through the back door. Loss. The specific stomach-dropping experience of something that was always there suddenly not being there anymore. And here's where it gets psychologically intricate. The avoidance deactivating strategies, all those mental and behavioral mechanisms designed to reduce their investment in the relationship, those strategies work by generating reasons why the connection isn't that important, by minimizing the attachment, by convincing themselves they're fine with less, fine with distance, fine with the relationship existing at a lower temperature. But those strategies only function when the connection is still fundamentally present, when you are still in orbit, even a distant one, when the deactivation is happening against a backdrop of your continued availability. The moment your availability genuinely shifts, the deactivating strategies have nothing to push against. And without that resistance, what's left is the raw material underneath. The actual attachment, the actual fear of losing something that mattered. What they feel when your detachment registers is not simple. It is not a clean, single emotion. It arrives as a confusing cluster of things that an avoidant is particularly ill-equipped to process. There is the shock of it, because on some level they genuinely did not believe this moment would come, not because you lied, but because their system had categorized you as reliably available, as someone whose love was durable enough to absorb whatever they needed to do. That categorization is now being revised in real time, and the revision is disorienting in a way that goes beyond surprise. Underneath the shock is something that functions like grief, though an avoidant will often struggle to identify it as such. It feels more like restlessness, like an itch they can't locate, like something slightly wrong that they can't name. They might find themselves thinking about you more, not with the fond, distant nostalgia of someone who has moved on cleanly, but with an urgency that catches them off guard, a recurring quality to the thoughts, a returning to memories not just of the good moments, but of the ordinary ones, the unremarkable Tuesday afternoons, the way you laughed at something small, the texture of being known by you. That returning is the attachment speaking. The attachment that their system was so committed to minimizing is now refusing to be minimized, because the threat of actual loss has activated it in a way that all your previous reaching never could. There is a profound irony at the heart of this that is worth sitting with, because it explains so much of the confusion you've carried. The avoidant is more capable of feeling their attachment to you in the presence of your absence than they ever were in the presence of your presence. Your closeness triggered their defense system. Your distance triggers their attachment system. The very thing that brings them toward the feeling of needing you is the thing you stopped doing in order to survive. You did not plan this. This was not a tactic. You didn't wake up one day and decide to emotionally withdraw as a strategic move to get a reaction. What happened was simpler and more human than that. You ran out. You reached the end of what a person can absorb before the self-preservation instinct finally, mercifully overrides the hope. And in that exhaustion, in that quiet surrender of the chase, you accidentally did the one thing that penetrates the avoidance defense system more effectively than any amount of love and patience ever could. You became someone they might actually lose. And now something is happening on their end that they will not immediately understand or articulate. There is a reassessment occurring. Quietly, internally, in the way that avoidants process everything, alone, without broadcasting it, in the private space where their actual feelings live separate from their presented self, they are reassessing the version of you they had constructed in their mind during the deactivation phase. That version, the one their system built to make the distance feel reasonable, was a diminished version, slightly too needy, slightly too intense, slightly too much. That diminishment was necessary. It made the withdrawal feel justified. But the diminished version doesn't hold up against the reality of your absence, because your absence has a weight to it, a specific gravity. And as they feel that weight, the constructed version starts to dissolve and the real one comes back into focus. The full one, the one who was patient when patience was undeserved, the one who stayed when leaving would have been reasonable, the one who loved them in a way that was, if they are being honest with themselves, rare. Genuinely rare. That recognition doesn't always come gracefully. For an avoidant, it often arrives as irritability, as a vague dissatisfaction with everything that has nothing to do with you, as an inability to settle, as the strange experience of getting exactly the space they said they needed and finding that the space feels hollow rather than relieving. Because what they actually wanted was never the absence of you, it was the absence of the vulnerability that came with you, and those are not the same thing. But they couldn't separate them, until now when one is gone and the other remains, and the distinction becomes impossible to ignore. Here is what you need to understand about where you are right now. The detachment you're experiencing, the quieting of the compulsive hope, the loosening of the grip, that is not the death of your love. It is the maturation of it. Love in its earliest form is undiscriminating. It attaches to potential, to feeling, to the intoxicating possibility of what something could become. Mature love, the kind that survives honest contact with reality, requires being able to see clearly and choose consciously. And for the first time you are seeing clearly. That clarity might feel cold compared to what came before. The hope was warm, even when it was hurting you. There was something almost comforting about the obsessive quality of it. The focus it provided, the sense of purpose in the trying. Detachment doesn't offer that warmth. It offers something better and less immediately comfortable. It offers ground. Solid, reliable, yours alone ground that doesn't shift depending on whether they texted back or how they seemed when you last spoke. You are building something in yourself right now that no relationship could ever build for you. And they are feeling the construction from a distance, feeling that you are becoming less available to be destabilized. That the version of you who could be kept in a state of suspended hope is being replaced by a version who has somewhere else to be, someone else to tend to, yourself. The question that tends to arise at this point, and it deserves a direct, honest answer, is whether any of this means they will come back. Whether the stunned quality of their realization, the grief underneath their restlessness, the reassessment happening in their private interior, whether any of that translates into actual change, into return, into them showing up differently. The honest answer is that it can, and it also may not. Both outcomes are possible, and which one occurs depends entirely on something that has nothing to do with you, the degree to which they are willing to do the internal work that their realization is pointing toward. Because a realization alone is not transformation, it is the beginning of a doorway. Whether they walk through it depends on resources and willingness and courage that exist inside them, not inside you. What you cannot do, what would cost you everything you've just built, is allow their potential realization to pull you back into the position of waiting, of monitoring, of being available to be managed again. Because the moment you re-enter that posture, the dynamic resets. Your nervous system knows this, even if the hopeful part of you doesn't want to. The work you've done, the quiet, unglamorous, deeply costly work of detaching from a hope that was not serving you, that work is not reversible in a single moment of their warmth. But it is fragile, and it requires protection. The protection of your own progress is not a glamorous subject. Nobody makes it sound important enough. It gets framed as self-care, as boundaries, as all the words that have been repeated so many times they've lost their edges. But what it actually is, stripped of the language, is this: a refusal to betray yourself again, a decision made quietly and renewed daily that the version of you currently emerging is worth more than the temporary comfort of slipping back into familiar pain. Because that's what going back feels like in the first moment. Familiar. And familiar, after a long period of uncertainty, can feel indistinguishable from safe. The warmth of their renewed attention, the texts that arrive with a different quality, the reaching that has a new urgency to it, the sudden presence of someone who was previously practicing absence, all of that lands on a nervous system that was conditioned to find relief in exactly this. In the return of the warmth after the cold, in the validation that you were not wrong to stay, that you were not wrong to love them, but this is the most critical junction in the entire arc, and it requires the clearest thinking you've done yet. When an avoidant reaches back after genuine detachment on your part, they are not reaching from the same place they occupied before. Something has shifted in them. That much is real. The realization was genuine. The grief underneath the restlessness was genuine. The reassessment of who you are and what your absence means, all of that happened. You did not imagine the shift in their energy. You did not manufacture the urgency in their return. But here is the distinction that will determine everything. There is a difference between someone reaching because they have done the work, because the realization cracked something open, and they followed that crack all the way down to its source and did something about it, and someone reaching because the discomfort of your absence has become greater than the discomfort of closeness. One is transformation, the other is relief-seeking. And relief-seeking, however genuine it feels in the moment, does not change the underlying architecture. The wall is still there. The deactivating strategies are still available. The nervous system is still wired the same way. And the moment the relief of your return settles and the intimacy begins to build again, the cycle has every reason to repeat. You have to ask yourself which one this is, and you have to ask it without the filter of hope. This is where your own psychology becomes the most important variable in the room. Because the pull you feel toward them when they reach, that pull is not simply love, though love is part of it. It is also the pull of a nervous system that learned, inside this relationship, that their warmth is the resolution to a very specific anxiety. Your system was trained on the cycle. Withdrawal created anxiety, return resolved it. And the brain, ever efficient, ever pattern-seeking, began to associate their presence with relief, and their absence with distress. That association does not dissolve just because you intellectually understand it. It lives below the level of rational thought. It lives in the body. And when they come back, when the warmth returns, when they say the things you needed to hear for so long, the body responds before the mind can intervene. The relief arrives first. The clarity comes later if you give it space to arrive at all. Giving it space is the work. In the specific electric moment of their return, when everything in you wants to lean in and let the relief wash over you, that is exactly the moment that requires the most presence, not coldness, not punishment, not a performance of indifference designed to teach them a lesson. Just presence. The ability to feel what you feel and simultaneously ask, is this the beginning of something different, or is this the temporary resolution of a cycle that is already repeated too many times? There is something that avoidants do when they return that is worth understanding deeply. They tend to return at their most open. The realization, the grief, the restlessness. All of that has softened them temporarily. They arrive with a quality of vulnerability that you may not have seen since the very beginning. And that vulnerability is real, it is not manufactured. In this moment, the wall is lower than it has been in a long time. But low is not gone, and the same conditions that built the wall originally are still present in their psychology. The same early wiring. The same automatic responses, the same nervous system that will, when the intimacy reaches a certain threshold, begin to fire the same alarms. The vulnerability of their return is a window. Windows are not structural changes. They let light in temporarily, and a relationship cannot be built in a window. What would need to be different, what would constitute genuine grounds for a different outcome, is not the quality of their feeling in this moment. Feeling has never been the problem. The problem has always been the system that feeling exists inside of. What needs to be different is whether they have developed new tools for what happens when the feeling gets threatening. Whether they have done the internal work that gives them something to reach for other than distance when the intimacy alarm goes off. Whether there is evidence, not promises, evidence of a different relationship with their own fear. And here you have to be ruthlessly honest with yourself about what constitutes evidence. Because in the heightened emotional state of their return, almost anything can look like evidence. A meaningful conversation can look like evidence. A display of emotion they previously withheld can look like evidence. The fact that they came back at all can look like evidence. But these things, while meaningful, are not the same as the sustained behavioral change that only reveals itself over time and under pressure. Evidence is who they are when the intimacy builds again and the alarm starts firing. Evidence is what they do instead of withdrawing when their system tells them to withdraw. Evidence is whether the tools they say they've developed are actually accessible when the nervous system is activated, not just when everything is calm and the reconnection is still new and the motivation is high. You cannot know that in the first conversation. You cannot know it in the first week. This is the part that requires an almost impossible patience. Not the old patience, the one where you waited for them to become available while shrinking yourself. But a clear-eyed, boundaried patience that is watching for specific things and is willing to name what it sees without catastrophizing or excusing. Let's talk about you in this moment. Not then, you, because there is something happening inside you right now that is more important than anything happening inside them. And it is the question of what you actually want, not what you wanted 6 months ago. Not what you wanted when the hope was loudest. What you want now from this new ground, with this new clarity. Because those might be different things, and you're allowed to discover that they are different things without it meaning that the love wasn't real. You are allowed to have changed. You are allowed to have grown, through the pain of this, into someone whose requirements have been clarified by the experience of going without them. You are allowed to look at what they are currently offering, even at their most open, even at their most earnest, and hold it against what you now understand you need. And if there is a gap, if what they are capable of now still does not reach what you genuinely require to feel safe, seen, and whole, you are allowed to name that gap. You are allowed to let it matter. That is not cruelty, that is not withholding. That is the most honest thing you can bring to any potential reconciliation or closure. The truth of what you need, stated clearly, without apology. Because a relationship built on your continued self-minimization is not a relationship, it is a performance. And you have given that performance long enough. There is a version of this where they return and they have genuinely changed, where the realization cracked something open that they followed all the way through, where they sought help, did internal work, developed the capacity to stay present when presence is hard, where they come back not as relief-seeking but as genuinely different. That version exists. It is not fantasy. Avoidant attachment is not a life sentence. People do the work. People change. Nervous systems, with consistent effort and the right support, do rewire. But that version of them, if it exists, will not need you to abandon your discernment to believe in it. It will be demonstrable. It will hold up under honest scrutiny. It will not ask you to lower your standards in order to accommodate its growth. Genuine change is not fragile in that way. It does not require you to stop paying attention. It does not feel like you have to choose between seeing clearly and being loving. The real version of changed, if it's there, can withstand your full, unfiltered, wide-awake presence. And if what they're offering cannot withstand that, if your clarity makes them defensive, if your requirements make them retreat, if your refusal to return to the old dynamic triggers the old distance, then the realization has not yet become transformation. And you have your answer. Not with bitterness, not with triumph, just with the quiet, settled knowledge of someone who finally, fully, believes what they're being shown. This is the part of the story that doesn't get told often enough, the part after the detachment, after the stunned realization on their end, after the reaching and the reunion, or the reaching and the recognition that reunion isn't the answer. The part where you are left with yourself, more fully, more honestly than you may have ever been, and the question of where to go from here is yours alone to answer. And that question is not as heavy as it once felt. Because you are not answering it from the same place you were in at the beginning of all this. You are not answering it from the contracted, adapted, hope-soaked place that spent so long trying to decode another person. You are answering it from the ground, from the quiet. From the version of yourself that survived the confusion and came out the other side with something the confusion could not take, a clearer understanding of what you are, what you need, and what you will no longer accept as a substitute for it. The avoidant being stunned by your detachment is not the ending of this story. It is a moment in it, an important one, a revealing one. But a moment, the ending, if there is such a thing, is not determined by their reaction to your growth. It is not determined by whether they come back, or how changed they are, or whether the relationship finds a new shape or closes entirely. The ending is determined by what you do with the clarity you've earned. Whether you use it to build something real, with them if transformation is genuine, or with someone else if it isn't, or alone in the interim in the rich and underrated space of your own becoming, that choice is the story. That choice is where your actual life is waiting. You have spent long enough living in the margins of someone else's fear, taking up the careful, apologetic amount of space that their comfort required, loving at the volume they could tolerate rather than the volume that was true. Your detachment stunned them because it was the first time they felt, viscerally, what the story looks like without you in it. Let that be the last gift you give from that particular place, the gift of your absence making your presence undeniable. And then, slowly, without rush, without the need for any particular outcome, turn toward the life that has been quietly waiting for you to have enough space to finally see it. It was always there, you were just looking somewhere else. You already know how this ends. Not the ending of the relationship necessarily, but the ending of the version of you that needed it to go a certain way. That version, the one who checked the phone, who rehearsed conversations, who lay awake constructing explanations for behavior that didn't require explanation so much as acceptance, that version has been quietly retiring. And what's taken its place doesn't have a name yet. It's too new, too unformed, but it's there, and it's yours in a way that nothing about the last stretch of time has been entirely yours. That's what this is really about. There is a tendency at this stage to want to wrap everything into a conclusion, to take all of the understanding, the attachment theory, the nervous system responses, the deactivating strategies, the cycle, and compress it into a lesson, something portable, something that makes the pain feel proportionate to the insight it produced. And while the insight is real and the understanding is genuinely valuable, the danger of the conclusion is that it can become another way of avoiding the feeling. Another sophisticated, intellectually satisfying way of staying in the head rather than completing the process in the body. Because the body has its own timeline, and it does not care how much you understand. You can have perfect clarity about why something happened and still feel the loss of it at 3 a.m. in a way that bypasses all the clarity completely. You can know, with absolute certainty, that the relationship was not capable of giving you what you needed, and still miss it. Still miss them. Still feel the specific shape of their absence like a room you keep walking into by accident. That is not regression. That is grief doing its job. And grief, when it is allowed to do its job without being rushed or intellectualized or replaced prematurely, metabolizes. It moves through, it changes form. It does not stay the same weight forever, even when it feels like it will. What you are grieving is layered. At the surface you are grieving them, the specific person, the specific warmth, the specific way they made you feel in the moments when the wall was down. That grief is real, and it deserves acknowledgement without minimization. The fact that the relationship was complicated does not make the love less significant. The fact that they were limited does not make the moments of genuine connection less true. You are allowed to miss what was real without that missing constituting a case for return. Underneath that surface grief is something older, something the relationship did not create but activated. The grief of a pattern that has likely visited you before, in different shapes, with different people, the pattern of loving someone whose availability was conditional, whose warmth was intermittent, whose presence required you to manage yourself carefully in order to maintain it. If this relationship felt familiar in a way that went beyond just this person, if there was something almost recognizable about the dynamic, something that felt like home even as it was hurting you, that recognition is worth your attention. Because the avoidant relationship does not typically choose its participants randomly, it tends to find people who have their own history with conditional love. People who learned early that affection was something to be earned rather than something inherent to their presence. People whose own nervous systems developed a particular fluency in the language of trying, of working for connection, of proving worthiness, of tolerating uncertainty as the price of love. If that lands somewhere in you, if it touches something that feels older than this relationship, that is not an accusation. It is an invitation to take the clarity you've developed about their patterns and turn it with equal curiosity and equal compassion toward your own. This is the layer that determines everything going forward, not the understanding of avoidant attachment, though that understanding is valuable. Not the ability to recognize the cycle, though that recognition will protect you. The layer that determines the future is what you discover when you ask yourself honestly why the uncertainty felt like love for as long as it did. Why the reaching felt more natural than the receiving. Why a relationship that required so much of you felt, at least in parts, like the right size. That question does not have a shameful answer. Whatever you find, there was a reasonable adaptation to something real that happened to you. The child who learned that love required effort became the adult who finds effortless love vaguely suspicious. The person who grew up with emotional unpredictability became someone for whom emotional consistency can feel almost boring. Not because they don't want it, but because the nervous system was calibrated on something more turbulent, and quiet waters register as stagnant. This is why the work is not simply about finding a more available partner next time, though that matters. It is about understanding why availability was not the thing that felt most like love. And it is about doing the patient internal recalibration that slowly, not overnight, not through a single realization, but slowly teaches your nervous system that safety is not the absence of passion. That consistency is not the absence of depth. That love does not have to cost you your peace in order to be real. The avoidant stunned realization, the thing that began this whole conversation, was ultimately a moment of their own reckoning. Not with you specifically, with themselves, with the cost of the system they've been running. Because your detachment didn't just tell them they might lose you. It held up a mirror. It showed them what their pattern actually produces in the end. Not the freedom they were protecting, not the safety they were maintaining, but this. The specific hollow quiet of having managed someone out of your life while convincing yourself you were just managing your own comfort. That reckoning is theirs to do something with. You cannot do it for them. You could not have accelerated it by loving them more patiently, or communicating more skillfully, or staying longer. It had to arrive on its own terms through their own experience of consequence. And it has. Whether they walk through the door that consequence has opened is a question only they can answer, with actions that only time will make visible. What you can do, what is entirely within your power and entirely worth your energy, is your own version of that reckoning, your own honest confrontation with the patterns that brought you here and the beliefs about love that kept you. Not as punishment, not as a project of self-improvement designed to make you more palatable for the next person, but as a genuine act of self-knowing, of becoming someone who is as fluent in their own interior as you became in theirs. Because here is what is true about you that this entire experience has demonstrated, even if it demonstrated it sideways. You are someone who commits, who stays present under difficulty, who extends enormous reserves of empathy and patience and good faith to people who are struggling. Those are not small things. In a world where genuine relational investment is increasingly rare, those qualities are extraordinary. The problem was never the qualities. The problem was the target. The reservoir of care and presence and patience that you carry, it was being poured into the one situation specifically designed to absorb it without ever filling. An avoidant relationship is a container with a hole in it. You can pour endlessly. The level never rises. And eventually you look at the empty container and wonder if you simply didn't pour enough. You poured enough. You poured more than enough. The container was the problem, not the water. And now, standing here, with the detachment that cost you so much to arrive at, with the clarity that the grief has slowly deposited like sediment settling after turbulent water, now the question is where to pour. Not frantically. Not immediately, not into the next available person as a way of proving to yourself that you are capable of being loved correctly, but thoughtfully, intentionally. With the discernment that this experience has sharpened in you, whether you asked for it or not, you know things now that you didn't know before. You know what emotional unavailability feels like in its early stages. The subtle signs, the small deflections, the way certain conversations dissolve, the particular quality of warmth that is being carefully rationed. You know the difference between someone who is genuinely private and someone who is using privacy as a managed distance. You know what it feels like to confuse intensity for intimacy and chemistry for compatibility and potential for presence. That knowledge is not cynicism, it is literacy. Emotional literacy earned the hard way, through experience rather than theory, and it is the kind that actually changes behavior rather than just informing it. You will not enter the next significant relationship as the same person who entered this one. Not because you have become guarded, but because you have become discerning. Because you now have a felt sense, in the body, not just the mind, of what it costs to override your own knowing in service of a hope. The last thing worth saying, and perhaps the thing that holds everything else together, is this. The avoidant in your life is not the villain and you are not the victim, in the flat, simple sense of those words. What you are is two people whose attachment systems, shaped by early experiences neither of you chose, found each other and created a dynamic that was almost structurally inevitable, given who you each were when you arrived. The anxious and the avoidant do not find each other by accident. They find each other because something in each of them recognizes something in the other. Because the dance is familiar. Because the roles fit in a way that feels, at first, like compatibility. And there was real compatibility. There was real love. There was something genuinely worth grieving. Holding that truth, the truth that something can be real and also not be right, that love can be genuine and also insufficient, that a person can care for you deeply and also not be capable of what you need. Holding that without collapsing it into a simpler story is one of the more mature emotional feats available to a human being. You are doing it. Right now, in the process of understanding all of this, you are doing it. So where does that leave you? Not with them, with yourself, with the life that exists outside the gravitational pull of this dynamic, with the morning that arrives regardless of whether they reached out, with the version of you that is slowly, without fanfare, beginning to take up the space that the hoping used to occupy. That space is yours. Fill it with things that do not require you to make yourself smaller. Fill it with people who find your needs reasonable and your presence welcome rather than overwhelming. Fill it with the quality of attention you have been lavishing on someone else's interiority turned inward, toward your own desires, your own becoming, your own quiet and private sense of what a good life actually feels like from the inside. You spent a long time trying to be something someone else could stay for. What would it mean to build something you don't want to leave? Not a relationship, a life. Your life. The one that doesn't hinge on whether they finally understand what they had. The one that moves forward not in spite of this experience, but genuinely metabolically informed by it, shaped by it, made more honest and more discerning and more deeply, specifically yours by everything it cost. They were stunned by your detachment because it was the first real glimpse they had of who you are without them at the center. Let that person, the one they caught a glimpse of, let that be the one you spend the rest of your energy becoming, not for them, not as proof of anything. Just because that person, the one standing on their own ground, seeing clearly, needing nothing from anyone's stunned realization, that person is who you were before any of this taught you to be smaller. And they have been waiting, with extraordinary patience, to come home.